Thank you so much, Tamar. Ambassador Varricchio, I'm so glad you could join us. My name is Ariel Yaffe. It's nice to meet you. As Tamar said, I'm the Director of Partnerships for the YPFP Summit and have taken on this technology platform as well. So thank you all for your patience and for the flexibility to continue to have this really important engagement session. We are just so delighted and honored to have Ambassador Varricchio here with us today for our first virtual summit. Just a couple of points when we get to the question and answer period. Please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen and make sure it goes to all panelists so that our staff can funnel the questions to me as we go along. So I will just get started and give a brief introduction of Ambassador Varricchio. My pronunciation may be a little bit off, so I apologize, but on March 2nd, 2016, Armando Varricchio presented his credentials as Ambassador of Italy to the United States, where he had previously served as the head of Economics, Trade, and Scientific Affairs section of the embassy from 2002 to 2006. Prior to that, he held many high-ranking positions, both within the Italian government and abroad. In particular, he specialized in European and transatlantic affairs during his years at the Italian representation to the European Union and at the Commission. Formerly ambassador to Belgrade, before that he served as a young diplomat in Budapest during the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union. While Chief Diplomatic Advisor to the Presidents of the Council of Ministers, Enrico Letta and Matteo Renzi, and Deputy Diplomatic Advisor to the President of the Republic, Giorgio Napolitano, he handled some of the most delicate international dossiers with a particular focus on security issues. He has a specific expertise in the field of global issues, as he served as the personal representative for Sherpa at G7, G8, G20 summits, both at national and European levels. Ambassador Varricchio graduated in international relations from the University of Padua in 1985 and entered the Foreign Service in 1986 and was promoted to the rank of ambassador in 2014. Prior to embarking on his diplomatic career, he worked in the private sector as an assistant to the director of the finance section of the Marzotto Textile Group. Ambassador Varricchio and the embassy have been very important partner with YPFP and the summit. They share YPFP's interest in engaging the next generation of leaders to build a more connected and peaceful future and ensuring that youth and youth voice is part of international foreign policy making. Ambassador, we're delighted to have you here today. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
I guess I will just start with a couple of quick questions, and then we can turn it over to the question and answer. I think something that we will start on, as you may presume, is something that has been top of mind for many of our delegates, many of our countries, and essentially the whole world, which is COVID-19. Italy has obviously been severely and substantially impacted by this pandemic. Can you just talk to us a little bit about, in your view, how Italy has changed and what you see as being the greatest challenges and also what opportunities may have come at this time?
Well, thank you, Ariel, and a warm hug to all friends and colleagues of this incredible group. Too bad we couldn't have the opportunity to meet in person here in Washington, D.C. It will be my pleasure, but I think that we can initiate this new series of virtual meetings. It is by no chance, by the way, that the first question pertains to COVID-19 effects. You're right, we have been spending the last weeks focusing on harnessing the emergency. Italy has been the first Western democracy to be hit severely by the virus. So we had to cope with health problems. We had to make sure that we are able to provide assistance to the many thousands of Italians who felt ill, and dealing with the social aspect, which had to do with the request, which has been put forward to our citizens to stay in shelter, to be protected, to avoid from physical person-to-person contacts, this has been very, very tough, particularly in a free country like Italy. But precisely because we have been able to comply with this request, and people perfectly understood the reason why they had to do this, now we are able to move forward. As of yesterday, we have reopened not just all major business activities, but free travel within Italy. It is important now that people can finally meet each other, meet with families, with friends, and reconnect, because this is what our free societies are based on, connection. But at the same time, as of yesterday, our Prime Minister took the floor and started to raise his gaze and in a way looking ahead. It is important that we are able to turn this crisis into an opportunity. Both at government level, but also our society understood that there are issues that cannot be postponed. For example, climate change, a different way of production, different way of working, issues that in a way are lessons to be learned. And now we have to start from there and build a better future.
Thank you. Yes, you know, you mentioned a different way of production, and actually one of our U.S. delegates had asked, you know, how are, you know, so to speak, made in Italy products that goes, and industry, so cars and fashion and even gastronomy, how are those industries navigating operations during the pandemic, especially given challenges for supply chains and decreases in consumer spending? And how will they manage that going forward?
Well, I think that we came out with the idea, even this time, that the world is connected. Our economies are fully integrated. Supply chain, no borders. At the same time, we have to protect our communities, our households, our nations. So there is a way to connect the two components of our world. I think that it would be a major mistake to give up to what we have come to know as globalization. The world is global. The response to major challenges has to be global. These are no times for, you know, national or local responses. At the same time, we have to make sure that when you refer to supply chain, these supply chains have to be trusted. So we have to trust other countries, our nations. We have to trust our friends and colleagues in our countries. And this has to do, in the end, with values, with democracy, with the freedom and liberties. So there is no difference between protecting rights, at the same time protecting the economy. And this is what a country like Italy, which has always been open to the world, we might pretend that globalization is something new, but if you go back in history, the Roman history, that was globalization, free circulation of people, of ideas, of goods within the then known world. That was a sort of globalization. So in a way, we have always been open to the world, and we wanted to remain open to the world. There's no alternative.
Well, I really appreciate Italy being open to the world personally, having visited there a couple of years ago and really enjoyed my time. So thank you for that. And I think that is you know, a huge part, an important piece of how to move forward in this time. And I was curious if you mentioned this globalization, and it should continue and should be rebuilt, and people should trust each other. Do you have any specific advice on how both our youth and our officials and of all our delegate countries, G7 countries and more, can take action to rebuild and foster that trust to ensure future globalization continues?
Well, you mentioned both youth and governments. I think that one of the lessons that we have been learned, I hope that we've been learning from this experience, is that we have to rely on expertise, on science, on knowledge. Complex problems require, study, understanding, learning. So this is why also for governments it is important to be informed, a bit knowledgeable, while at the same time has always been accountable. At the same time, now more than ever, there is a need for a greater engagement of our youth, because we are, in a way, entering into uncharted water again. So there is a need for open mind, there is a need for enthusiasm, there is a need for new ideas and fresh ideas. That's why having young people like the members of this amazing group being engaged, being aware, and first of all being driven by the passion, I think is absolutely necessary. These are no time for retrenching into our own personal or local space and having sort of blind eyes to what is happening in the world. It is true, these days we're very much focused on our own space, but we don't have to neglect what is happening elsewhere. Now that finally the curve of the virus, for example, is dramatically declining in many democratic countries and in many rich countries, we can see that there are new areas that deserve attention and concern. I think, for example, about Africa. What is happening there is directly affecting our own interest, our own safety, and our own security. So youth enthusiasm, passion, and engagement are important now more than ever.
Yeah, I think it's definitely important to consider the ripple effects that each individual country and the experience they're going through can have on the rest of the world. That's a great point. Another question I wanted to talk about is, I'm aware that Italy is quite engaged on issues of both energy and climate change, and we actually just had our presentation on the energy and energy security track. So with climate change being such a high topic on the Italian government's agenda, how is Italy planning to advance that agenda during this time right now, during COVID, and when things are very challenging in general?
As part of the European Union, we fully share and we are advocating now a focus on a new Green Deal. It is important that we focus and we try to concentrate our financial resources and new investments on areas that are connected to now efficient and more sustainable economy with also a cleaner energy. We have a great opportunity as Italy because next year, 2021, Italy will be chairing the G20, so this will be the top priority of our agenda. And also next year, we will co-chair with the UK COP26, which will be a great gathering where, again, the different countries of the world, after the division of recent years, following the great moment of the Paris Accord, when there was a sort of shared drive, enthusiasm towards new ambitious targets, can resume cooperation. I have a vivid memory of those days in my capacity as Chief Diplomatic Advisor to the Italian government. I was in Paris. I will never forget that moment with the signing of the accord, and people of different countries really committed to a common goal. There's nothing like protecting the environment that can unite countries and helping setting aside differences, unilateral moves, and considering altogether citizens of the world.
Something that came up earlier, just to sort of follow up on that point, is a question arose that do you think if climate change is not actively and adequately addressed, do you think that it could impact global peace and security, and how do you see that impacting global peace and security?
Well, we have seen in recent years now that climate change is one of the single most important components of the global security. One of the issues that now figure on top of our country's agenda is migration. Immigration that is inflaming the political discourse, which is creating enormous problems, which is a tragedy from a human rights point of view. And one of the single most important driving forces of migration is climate change. You've seen in parts of Africa that when local populations affected by the effect of climate change cannot assure a living for themselves and their families, they are left with no choice but to migrate, which is always an ultimate and tragic decision, leaving places, leaving families, households, communities, and trying to enter into an unknown situation, facing terrible distress and difficulties. So tackling global change also helps avoiding this and ensuring that in many parts of the world there are opportunities for growth, for ensuring that local communities thrive and are given the opportunities they deserve. So I think that this cannot be an issue that we set aside and sometimes we bring back in our discussion. It has always to be on top of our agenda.
That's excellent and great to hear. The Italian delegation actually wanted to ask you how in an increasingly multipolarized world, what role will the G7 play, and what's the main challenge that a G7 representative faces?
In a globalized world, in a world that we can label with different definitions, the G7 remains a crucial forum for discussion because countries share democratic values, who share the concerns and the problems of taking democratic decisions, have the opportunity to exchange in a very informal, structured, unscripted way ideas that we can then transmit and transfer to the global debate. The reasons why in the 70s the G7 was created are still there. We do know that no group can pretend representing the complexities and the differences of the world. The G7 still has the coherence, the capability and the political will to address not just issues that are of the interest of the members of the group, but which are by definition global. There is a need for leadership and leadership has to be assured by democratic countries. We have to refrain from one of the recurrent temptations that even these days when our communities were facing with the terrible crisis, that autocratic governments can act faster and better. We have to absolutely rule out this. Only by serving people's interests and asking people to have their voice expressed loud and clear, we can have the legitimacy to represent them and act in the people's interests. And only democracies can do that. So that's why G7 still has today in 2020, even with the virtual now of forms, the absolute responsibility to act for the better. And so I wish all the best to the U.S. presidency of the G7 this year, and I think that this will be absolutely important.
Well, so, you know, it's good to hear that you still believe there is a good and functional role and very important role for the G7. I was curious on what your thoughts on and what Italy's position is on President Trump's efforts to expand the G7 to include Russia and India. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that in the history of the G7, you also have been very kind in mentioning my own previous experience. I'm a sort of dean of the G7 because I served as Sherpa to 6 summits. 3 as in my capacity as European Sherpa when I was wearing a European hat, and then 3 in my national capacity. So I've seen many summits unfolding, and there's always been the responsibility of the sitting chair to invite to side events other countries. To use one of the G7 jargon words, this is the sort of outreach session. So what the US chair of the G7 has in mind is to do what has been done, for example, by France, the last G7, to have an outreach session with other leaders. So President Trump has extended invitations to leaders of different countries for side events, and I think this is good. Because this gives leaders the opportunity to exchange ideas, views, and spreading the message. But, and I get back to my previous comments, the reason why the G7 has the number is very clear. And the reason why, for example, the G7 still is the G7 were true back in 2014, and are still true now in 2020.
And we are so grateful to have you here also because of your past experience as a Sherpa. And actually, if you could just speak to perhaps during your experiences as a Sherpa, what were your proudest moments or biggest successes during those experiences, and what were the challenging moments for you?
You know, the very name Sherpa, as you know, comes from the silent, resilient, incredible men who bring on their shoulders, you know, heavy weight and help climbing the highest cliffs in the beautiful part of the world, the very, very high cliffs of the Himalaya. They're silent. Nobody normally knows their names, but everybody understands that they're crucial for the success of the ultimate endeavor. Sherpas in summits sit behind the leaders. Leaders are sitting around a round table, and just behind they have just one person, the Sherpa, who can step in when it's necessary. But it's not just in meetings, throughout the year, because the G7 chair lasts for one solar year. The Sherpas negotiate, text, discuss, debate. Sometimes they have very, very open and candid, as we diplomats say, discussions, trying to narrowing down differences and come to a common understanding. In my capacity, I'm attending many days and long nights of discussions. But I'm always been able to take advantage of the informality, of the friendship, solidarity, and the sort of camaraderie amongst the fellow Sherpas. This has helped us a lot. These days, it's somewhat customary to focus on differences amongst in politics or policies sometimes of our leaders of the G7 countries. But believe me, I am a living testimony of previous very harsh debates and discussions. We are not coming out of a sort of golden age where everything was, love and peace and friendship. This has never been the case. Leaders have always been very, very strong in their positions, sometimes very archly divided by political lines, personal sensitivities, differences in backgrounds. So that's why it is so important to have a forum like the G7 that allows them to express themselves in a free, open, unscripted way. I think that one of the reasons why the G7 still is live and running is because of those silent men and many women, because I enjoyed the tremendous friendship with great colleagues, women colleagues of different countries who serve as Sherpas, and we have always been united in making sure that the process goes on.
Excellent. You mentioned earlier that leadership is important to continue cohesion and globalization and making sure that there's progress. As a high-profile government official, how do you approach leading through a crisis? And how do you manage decision-making during difficult times?
Again, I think that it is important to make sure that national interests are put to the service of a broader agenda. Because global issues like a pandemic, that in its own etymology, with pan comes from Greek, is global, is the world. So I think that elected officials have to respond to those who elected them, and this is part of democracy, and we perfectly understand. But at the same time, it is important to be able to cooperate with other leaders. And this is what we do, if I may, as a proud European, refer to this incredible project that we've been building since the 50s in Europe, merging our responsibilities, merging our authority for a broader agenda. This is what we do every single day. It was not easy when we were 6. It is even less easy today that we are 27. As you can imagine, this requires, again, diplomacy in a way. But I think that whenever the EU takes a decision, this is a sort of magic. That countries that come from past of fierce division, tragedies, wars, are able to work together for a broader interest and for something higher. That's why even on the global stage, the EU is an incredible example. And by the way, in these days of crisis, Europe paid a price in terms of public opinion. Many in our countries got with the impression that Europe was not as high as we had expecting them to our expectations. I think this is a mistake. If we compare what the European Union has been able to do in this crisis to what Europe did back in 28, 29, and then 2011, 2012, with the two former great financial crises, Europe has done magic this time. Always taken into consideration that, again, democracy is difficult, sometimes painful, requires great efforts, but I think, as we all know, there is no alternative and this is the best system that we have.
Thank you for that. Before we just turn over to the question and answers that I'm getting a lot of questions, so that's great. I just wanted to ask, following up on youth engagement, how Italy engages youth and ensuring that voices of the youth are heard and incorporated into policy making more largely.
This is a very good point, because we have to acknowledge that young people suffer tremendously during this crisis. The very fact that in our countries, high schools, colleges, universities have been shut down and operating only through online classes, this has came to a heavy cost, because school academia is absolutely crucial, is irrenounceable, is the place where we not just create new leaders, but we create citizens and we give strength to our societies. So I think that our youth have to be engaged and listened to. I do expect that now that even in my country, the decision has been taken to open a sort of open discussion to different parts of the society, to the different stakeholders, so that they can come up with ideas, proposals, suggestions, how to make our societies better, more efficient, more resilient, and how we can also invest the resources that the EU has been able and will be able to provide. Youth have to be sitting at a table. They have to be listened, because when we refer to stakeholders, I think that their voice is the most important. Your voice is the most important, because the moment when we build our future, you are the ones who will be living the future. You will be the ones who will be the future leaders. So we have to be careful not to take decisions these days that hamper your opportunity in the future to serve the interest and the goals that you will consider necessary and appropriate.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being here to be part of youth engagement and for listening to them. And I hope that your Italian delegation reaches out to you to talk about the communique when it's finalized. So thank you. I'm going to switch to some questions here. So let me just see here. Here's a question again about COVID-19. It says, concerning COVID-19, the international community must balance the safety of citizens with economic recovery. Aren't there solutions that prioritize both? Can you speak to us about that?
Well, this has been I would say the most serious challenge of all our leaders, how to contemplate the two different issues and try to avoid sort of trade-off between the two. During the first phase of the crisis, obviously, public health has been considered a priority. Now I think we are in a position to focus more on the need to revamp the economy. No secret, all our economies have been suffering dramatically. All the numbers are appalling. We've never have expected to live through in our times through some so difficult moments that are similar to what we have been written in history books of the Depression years of the late 20s, early 30s of the last century. So I think that now it is important to focus on the economy, on the social aspect, particularly because this has been translated into dramatic loss of jobs. And in many countries, particularly here in this country where I now serve in the US, unemployment and jobless also produce effects on public health because people who do not get their check, they don't have the means to protect themselves. So there is a need to revamp the economy. What our countries have been doing has been very important. Fiscal stimulus has been unprecedented. So I think that the resources are there. But again, precisely because the resources are there, it is important that they are addressed to heal the structural problems and the structural wounds of our society. Inequalities, differences, protection of health in workplaces. So I think that we have an opportunity. As someone has said in the past, never waste a good crisis, because you are given the opportunity to learn from experience and not trying to get back to where you are coming from, but trying to move forward and do something better. Again, this requires leadership, education, and strength.
Excellent. Another question was that globalization has had arguably a negative impact for some developing countries, such as exploitation of natural resources and cheap labor. How should developed countries such as Italy work to create a level ground for these developing countries, and how problematic are these issues?
This is an excellent question. I think that turning blind eyes to what has been happening in other countries, pretending that this might be serving our own interest is a mistake. We have to work on a level playing field. We have to make sure that our standards are fully complied also in other parts of the world, consumer protection, environment protection, protection of rights, particularly of children and women. This is something that I think is very, very clear to our leaders. So this is why I think that this international cooperation is crucial, because reinforcing supply chain and making sure that there are no loopholes, and that also our business leaders are made more aware of the need to ensure the same level of protection also to the workers in business plans that it might have in other parts of the world is absolutely crucial. So this multilateral and multinational approach has to be strengthened and reinforced for sure.
There's been a couple of questions about what are some alternatives to sort of more violent or aggressive strikes and protests that are happening right now, and how do young people contribute in making changes in an alternate way other than just violent striking and protests?
Being engaged, showing up to the polls. I know that in all our countries, unfortunately, at every election, young people do not show up at the same rate as elder people, for example. I think this is a mistake. Being active leader in a society, being engaged, I think that is absolutely crucial. if we want to change what is not working. It is important to demonstrate, to participate in rallies. We've all done that in our history. I've done the same when I was a young man. But of course, that is important, but it's not enough. I think that it is absolutely crucial that what democracy offers as a series of tools to really enforce change are fully exploited. Participating, debating, advocating, but in the end, voting.
Thank you. Yes, everybody vote. I agree. This is a great question. It's one of our attendees that I'm thinking of becoming a diplomat in the future, but I feel reluctant due to largely different views between myself and the government. What's your advice for managing that disconnect or the difference between personal values and government ideology?
There's always there's a fine line to walk in a way that we are with our own ideas, we are part of a community, but we serve the government. For example, in Italy, diplomats are not allowed to be members of any political party because we wanted to ensure our citizens that our actions are not politically driven. We are above politics. I think that this is very important because in a way we can serve a greater good. We do represent not just the sitting cabinet, but we represent the nation. So in the different components. So this is what diplomats do. But there's an aspect that, to respond to the question, I would like to bring to the attention of everyone. One of the most rewarding elements of my profession as a career diplomat has always been the camaraderie with colleagues of different countries. Because in a way we consider ourselves as citizens of a special world. We know that there are differences. Our leaders can dispute. Our leaders can sometimes fight diplomatically, I would say. But we are the ones who are there to narrowing down differences, to ensure that dialogue goes on. I think this is a great responsibility. You were very kind in recalling my early days as a diplomat in a communist country. I do remember, I have vivid memories of meetings, discussions with colleagues of the so-called Soviet group there. Of course, respecting differences and never forgetting where we were standing, but always being able to maintain an open door, and maintain that open door always reduces spaces for confrontation and conflict. We are not given rifles or other sort of weapons. Our only weapon is our word, our ability to debate, discuss, and hopefully to persuade our interlocutors that coming sometimes halfway is the best way to avoid confrontation.
Excellent. Another question is, in what cases should personal liberties be sacrificed for national security?
Well, I might quote Shakespeare or ancient Rome, great writers, or the Greek tragedies. the fine line between a greater good and personal rights and personal ideas. This has always been the human tragedy. Try to realize that we are not alone, that we are citizens of a greater community. And sometimes what French say, la raison d'etat, so that has to sometimes prevail against individual freedoms. But again, the ambition of every person, humankind, has always been to avoid that terrible choice, and try to make sure that the two different goals tend to coincide. This is not always possible. We all know about the terrible choices that a great leader that has been recalled these days, Winston Churchill, had to make during the war, sacrificing the life of local communities, maybe for the greater goal of winning the war. This is something that is the tragedy of the man, to quote a famous book. But again, I think that history can to help. We talk about the importance of learning, studying. I think that reading history remains absolutely crucial to better understand nowadays problems and putting them into perspective.
That's, I think, really great advice. Know where we've been and what has happened in order to move forward and understand what's happened. Another question, which I think is really interesting, is which topic would be a big mistake for the youth and the newer generations coming up not to take serious actions on in our current time?
Yeah, a major mistake. Turning your back to the compelling problems of our times, pretending that while protecting your small household, you might be somewhat isolated. I think it is a major mistake. I understand. If we again turn to reading histories of the different plagues that we have been living in our countries, particularly in Europe, for example, there's always been the temptation to shut down the door, turn down the shades, and pretending that by isolating ourselves we are safer and more secure. This might be true initially, but it is not paying off in the long run. So, for example, in this case, I'm very happy and honored as representative of Italy that all my interlocutors here in the U.S. government, particularly those more engaged in fighting the virus, have been always appreciative of our decision to provide information, to be transparent and not concealing the situation in Italy. I think this has been a very important choice.
Yes, I think erring on the side of transparency generally is very helpful in passing information to any population or citizenry. Another question is, this person says, I want more youth voices to be heard, but in my country, the government isn't really doing much to provide us the platform. How do you think we should approach this problem? So if the government isn't as engaged as maybe Italy's government is with their youth and offering a seat at the table, what actions should people take? I know you mentioned earlier, being active and advocating, but is there anything else if the government isn't doing something there?
Pushing the government to do so. So having your voice heard and has to be shouted loud and clear. Absolutely. No alternative.
Another question here is, the world is still suffering from the effects of the Iraq War 17 years later. How can we ensure such a catastrophic mistake by global superpowers doesn't happen again?
You know, history never repeats itself, but can learn from mistakes. So we have to make sure that conflicts and wars are not considered the solution, particularly the so-called wars of choice. You know, the decision was made in the past between war of choice and war of need. Wars of choice are never producing good effects and are never easy to win.
This is another timely question, but what are the measures taken by Italy and your government to cooperate or to promote mental health of your citizenry? That's a really important issue right now, especially you know, with all over the world, people losing their jobs and their income. They can't see family, like you were mentioning before. You know, they're maybe not used to working from home and feel isolated. And mental health is a big issue, even aside of COVID times, but it's definitely being even more magnified. So can you speak to what your country is doing, and then what the globe should maybe be looking to do?
It's a crucial issue. By the way, I am promoting a number of these discussions, webinars across the United States with Italian scientists, scholars, active these days in fighting COVID-19 and the different components. And I've been very interested in listening in some of our brightest scholars here discussing about the mental health issues and components. Every crisis has a direct effect on mental health problems, widening and expanding the problems of our society. You know, Italy, I am very proud as Italians that a great Italian hero at psychiatry in the past, he gave his name to a very forward-looking law that was enacted by the Italian Parliament years ago to shut down asylums. So spaces where patients were secluded and treated as a sort of prisoners separated from society. Try to never to forget that they are citizens and they deserve treatment, but not they do not deserve to be isolated and secluded from society. I think this is very important. The anxiety that any major crisis poses to our community is increasing. Those who lose their job, who can suffer from loss of loved ones, that feel somewhat detached from the mainstream of our societies. I think these are all phenomena that we have to take care of. And healing not just the physical wounds, but the mental wounds of a period like the one that we are living through is absolutely necessary and crucial.
Thank you. Well, we're just about out of time. I'll give you just a moment to give a remark, but one question I had for you. I know a lot of our delegates in their introductions, which you can see the YouTube video, we'll send that to you so you can see the delegate introductions later, but they a number of them mentioned a favorite book of theirs, and I know you've mentioned several quotes and several books, and you have a nice stack of books behind you as well. Is there one book that you love, that's your favorite book, or that you would really highly recommend to all the attendees as something that is a must-read?
Well, you know, of course, I have many books in my bookshelf, reading both current affairs and history book as well as, you know, fiction. Maybe I might be telling you what I'm reading these days. You know, I'm reading current affairs. I'm covered by information, news, magazines. So sometimes I find some moments of respite, some moments in reading War and Peace. I'm reading this great Tolstoy fiction work. I think that is very inspiring, entertaining, and profound. These are all qualities that we appreciate, particularly in times when we are confronted with great stress and pressure. That's, you know, reading, learning, thinking, and also having fun, because reading sometimes pages of dances in St. Petersburg, or you know, flirts among young officers and young ladies in Moscow in those times, I think is helping you in thinking that we will go through this. We managed to overcome those tragic years with wars, with crises, but the resilience of men and women, and particularly young men and women like yourself, is the best possible recipe to build a better world.
Thank you so much. I was going to say you could have other closing remarks, but I would say that is a really great point to end on. We really and truly appreciate your time. It's my distinct honor to have met you and had a chance to speak with you. This has been a great and inspiring conversation. You know, our hearts are with Italy and the rest of the world as we go through these challenging times. But I think, as you said, you know, we will become stronger by it and work our way through it. And I'm really excited that, you know, we have as many youth on this summit here that are going to be engaged in going out into the world to give their ideas and engage. So thank you for being with us, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you in person sometime in the near future.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ariel. Thank you for steering this debate. I, from here in Washington, to all your friends and colleagues, say ciao.
Grazie mille.